I was invited to Square Enix's London office last week to play 2 short demos of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth amounting to just over an hour of playtime. We also had a short presentation with messages from Naoki Hamaguchi and Yoshinori Katase, which contained a little bit more information to be gleaned by a Final Fantasy VII hungry motherfucker like me. Just can't get away, can't escape it. I want to make this video as in-depth and comprehensive as possible to properly analyze and break down all aspects of my time with the game for people really wanting to sink their teeth into the nitty-gritty details. I've broken up this video into chapters that you can navigate to using the timestamps in the description at your own discretion to topics that interest you, or to skip over particular elements if either you don't care or there are aspects you would rather experience yourself the first time that you play. I want to also state that overall, I had a really good time playing this, and I'm hugely grateful for Square giving me this chance. That said, I'm never going to let opportunities like this or free things alter the way I analyze a game. It would be disingenuous. I always aim to be as fair as I can without compromising my true feelings. Some of the stuff I was originally going to talk about in depth in this video have recently been detailed in the blog posts both on PlayStation and Square Enix's website, so I'll be more brief on some of those topics. Feel free to check out those articles for full information in the description. I want to give a brief spoiler warning that although these demos didn't nearly spoil anything, I will be talking in the story chapters of this video from the perspective of someone who has knowledge of every entry in the Final Fantasy VII series. So if you're avoiding spoilers for the OG or compilation entries, probably skip over the story sections of these videos, because I'll be discussing aspects that relate to the original Final Fantasy VII and compilation to make critiques or draw comparisons. But I'll be giving fair warning before I do so. This video is in no way supposed to be a fundamental judgment on the quality of the overall game, just of the parts that I played. So where I'm drawing particular conclusions, don't assume that's me saying the entire game will befall this flaw, or the entire game is great because of this. What I'm really saying is that the demo conveyed this to me, but it's not conclusive of the final product. It can't be, it's such a small slice. That said, I did want to be as in-depth as possible to critically analyze both the narrative and gameplay of these demos. Alright, I think that's everything at the top of the video. Use the timestamps to jump to the bits that you're interested in, or strap in for the full analysis. I hope you enjoy. I have what you might call a complicated relationship with Final Fantasy VII. If you're unfamiliar, I'll summarize, because I feel you can't truly get a good feel for my critique or analysis if you don't know my connection to Final Fantasy VII and its legacy. I do think context is important for any sort of critique. I first played Final Fantasy VII in July of 2022, which really isn't all that long ago. I played it 2 years after I first played Remake, which was my first foray into Final Fantasy in general. Since then though, I've played the entire compilation, Remake at least 5 times, read the novels, done research into the development history, old dev interviews, new dev interviews, stayed up till 6 AM on many nights speculating about where the Remake trilogy will go on my girlfriend's Discord server. I'm well versed in Final Fantasy VII. If you want to see my entire journey, you also can. I have a playlist that's on this channel. I'll link it below if you want to check it out. The short of it though is that although Remake was my entry into Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy VII, and although I will always have a soft spot for it, the OG is far and away one of the greatest games ever made, and I feel every addition made to it since 1997 is somewhat of a detraction from the themes and core fundamental message of Final Fantasy VII, at least as to why I fell in love with it. That said, I still find myself attached to Final Fantasy VII, to the lore and legacy, and whether I find the direction of the Remake project to be worrying or not, I'm on board for the ride and want to give the whole thing a fair crack, which led to me saying yes to Square's offer to give Rebirth a go. Because of how invested I am in this brand though, for better or for worse, I think it gives me a unique perspective of being able to really break down aspects of this game in a way that is meaningful to other Final Fantasy VII fans that at least think the same way that I do, I guess. I'm not really the type of person ever to sit with the sole conclusion of, well, this is quite fun, or this thing sucks. I've made an entire career off of spending far too much time exploring the deeper reasons for my feelings on games, and I want to do this justice by diving as deep as I possibly can. This is not just my feelings or how the game felt to play or my general thoughts. This is going to be a deep, comprehensive analysis of everything I experienced, as deep as I can go with the limited footage and time I had with it anyway. And while I suppose you could maybe class me as a Remake hater and Final Fantasy VII purist, I'm not one of those remake haters or Final Fantasy VII purists. Okay, I can be, but most of the time I'm not. I try to be as fair as I can, especially in videos like this one. But I do believe in the integrity of Final Fantasy VII and will criticize the aspects that seem to step out of line with what I believe the original vision conveyed, at least to me on an emotional level, that's integral to its overall feeling, either in small or large ways. But I'll always do so with as much reasoning as possible, so that others and everyone watching can glean whether that particular piece of criticism matters to them. Okay, I think that's the context out of the way. Like I said, I played 2 demos, one being a short section in Mount Nibel from the flashback in Calm, the other a sequence leading into the party's arrival in Junon Harbor, both segments that are early on in the original Final Fantasy VII's first disc. I believe these will also be the segments that will be playable at Tokyo Game Show, but I'm writing the script before any announcements. Since each demo had a different focus, one being story, the other being combat and exploration, there's a lot of different things to talk about. I'll start by discussing the story from Mount Nibel, and then the story from Junon, afterwards delving into the game mechanically, drawing from both demos at once. To set this demo up, it takes place as Cloud and Sephiroth are sent to the Nibelheim reactor to investigate some issues they've been having. We saw an earlier shot from this sequence in the first teaser of the game that was ever released. Their guide, a young girl from the town called Tifa, and a platoon of Shinra troops make their way to the reactor. This demo picks up just after the party falls from the bridge in the original game and has to make their way through the caves of Mount Nibel. It was a short 20-minute segment, but there's a lot to cover. The story was the focus of this particular demo. Spoilers will follow for the OG and compilation, so if all you want to know is gameplay and mechanical analysis, skip over this entire story section. I won't hold it against you. Okay, so as you know, Cloud is not who we're truly playing here. It's Zack Fair through Cloud's distorted memories, and that has never been made more abundantly clear than in these cutscenes. Cloud here is plucky, he's energetic, his animations are Zack through and through. This is what Cloud would look like were his imitations of Zack truly accurate. In Remake, what we see is a version of Cloud trying to be Zack, to mimic his memories of Zack. These memories of Nibelheim are how Cloud thinks he's acting in Remake, but to an audience we can see the stark differences. From how he talks to Tifa about the planet running out of Mako.
Except the planet's huge. Mako will never run out, right?
To the animations, just idly or in gameplay. They've worked here to make sure the memories of Zack are not tainted and are accurately portrayed. This is how Cloud remembers it because this is how it happened. He just thinks it was him instead of Zack. There's an aspect to this that I really like because, of course, this is how you're going to portray it when you're not restricted to the hardware of the PlayStation 1. Of course, how Cloud acts in modern day and how he acts in his memories will be tangibly different to us as onlookers, but to Cloud, it's the same, and it makes a lot of sense that they've portrayed that here. Cody Christian also does a fantastic job. It's almost like they've got Caleb Pierce to do all the scenes as Zack, and then just had Cody mimic it. Like Genova. And to be fair, they probably did do that. It's really well executed for the concept that they're going for. That said, I do think being constrained to the PlayStation 1 hardware meant they had to be creative with how they conveyed the subtle hints that ultimately led to the big twist. I feel the presentation of these modern games, in a way, doesn't actually serve the story as well. However, it's very clear that Square doesn't care too much about this twist anymore. It's likely it won't be the major reveal as it was in the OG anyway. In Remake, Hojo outright spoils it.
My memory was mistaken. My boy, you weren't a soldier.
Crisis Core Reunion, which they've marketed as something to play before Rebirth, also completely spoils the mystery of Final Fantasy VII's story anyway, and so odds are, in Rebirth, finding out Cloud's memories are really of Zack won't be the big reveal it originally was. Whether you like that or not is something else entirely, and I don't really want to get into the worms of it all, as it were, but it feels this is a reinforcement of that idea. Knowledge of Crisis Core is more important to the Remake project than the original's plot twist remaining intact. At least that's how it feels to me, which lines up with the ending of Remake. This is a new story doing new things and taking our characters to new places. The core mystery of Rebirth will not primarily be Cloud's funky memories, it will be much greater in scope. And again, whether you like that or not, that's up to you. One of the cool things here though is that Cloud is with you. This random infantry guy is obviously Cloud. I like that little detail, it's fun. Like, obviously he had to be with you, it would make no sense if he wasn't, but I like that he's sort of standing around vibing. Throughout this sequence, the party consists of Cloud and Sephiroth, the same as it did in the original game. Differently from the OG, however, we are able to take control of Sephiroth. I'll talk more about the mechanical specifics of this later on, but I do find it interesting that Sephiroth has a whole moveset, almost like maybe he's not only going to be used for this one sequence. I can't imagine when he'd be used again, but he really has a whole set of moves, abilities, a triangle ability, etc. Everything that you would expect from a mainstay party member. It's odd because Red didn't get that same treatment in Remake, and he actually is a mainstay party member. Just some food for thought, I guess. On a story front, it's an interesting change though. Of course, I'm sure a lot of longtime fans are just hyped to play as Sephiroth, and fair enough, it is somewhat cool as a feature. However, I feel once that novelty wears off, what I found is that you don't have the same heavy impact that the original game had. In the original, not playing as Sephiroth allowed you to witness his sheer power that you were unable to command yourself, that you would have by yourself at the end of the game, but not this early on. Cloud, you, would take damage and instantly die. Sephiroth, however, would then decimate the enemies in single blows or with powerful spells. It instills you with this sense of envy, like Cloud had, but also a sense of awe too, and a goal to work towards by the end of the game. It's also intimidating once Sephiroth turns on you. That's the force you're up against, a force you weren't even in command of. So when Cloud takes him down in the reactor room, it holds infinitely more weight. It's not a totally egregious change, but I do think it's a shame. There's also the fact that in Rebirth, Cloud and Sephiroth's health and damage output aren't even that different. They're only a few levels apart from each other, and so Sephiroth doesn't even seem that impressive compared to what Cloud is doing. I can only assume this change was made out of Square's love of Zack Fair and not wanting him to come across as weak to people once they discover it was actually Zack here and not Cloud, so they made him more powerful in this sequence. I personally think the whole thing just falls a little bit flat for the sake of a fan service novelty of playing as Sephiroth. What you do have though throughout the sequence is Sephiroth talking to Cloud, or Zack, I can't make up my mind on what to call him, you get the point, guiding him and giving him advice, which is a nice thing to add. I think maybe I prefer the tight-lipped Sephiroth of the original, but I do feel this is more in line with how he was characterized in the compilation, in Crisis Core for example. A bit more camaraderie there. Heading through the level and eventually going up against the boss called Materia Guardian in Rebirth, rather than Materia Keeper as it was in the original game, a boss you don't fight until your return to Nibelheim as Cloud later with the main party. I would assume it's still fought later on again, but it's a tougher version probably. The two truly have to team up here, with Sephiroth leading the battle and Cloud following close behind. You can definitely sense in terms of dialogue the skill difference between the two. I just wish that also carried over into the gameplay of it all as well. There are also two different instances here in which the game very, very overtly points out that he is Zack, with this line as the boss first begins.
You said you wanted to be a hero.
Wish I hadn't.
Speaking to Zack's dream of wanting to be a hero, which to an unsuspecting player would just line up with the things that Cloud said on the water tower to Tifa about wanting to be a hero like Sephiroth. And then finally with this not so inconspicuous reference.
You're practically panting.
I'm excited.
Such a puppy.
Sorry, that one just gets me. This, of course, is a reference to the nickname Angeal had for him that Genesis also calls him throughout Crisis Core. I'll keep my opinions on this one to myself. Maybe stop by a stream and we can have a proper chat about all of this. I'm sure for fans of Crisis Core, this is a great moment that ties things together and calls back to Zack's history with his mates and allies. Very cool. And that's where this demo ends story-wise. It's the most story-heavy of the two, but even still, it's quite light on heavier details. But what is here is definitely interesting. Let's move on to the story of demo number 2. This demo takes place just as the party leaves the Mithril mines after meeting the newest Turk, Elena, or at least that's what I assume if this follows the original game. Usually after leaving the mines you head to Junon, or you can head over to Fort Condor. In Rebirth you simply come out in the Junon wilds with the Junon fortress as your destination in the distance. There is, however, this moment. That would be a Condor, picking up one of the failed Sephiroth clones that Cloud has a bit of a reaction to, as you'd expect due to their Genova link, and it carries it away. I guess he won't be making it to the reunion. That said, could this be an instance of like Chekhov's failed Sephiroth clone? Will he be making an epic return in a quest later when we do visit Fort Condor? I don't know, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Red here continues his strange new character trait of dumping random exposition about the world, saying there's a story about a great condor said to roost on an island's abandoned reactor, and now there's no way to reach the island, or at least none that he's aware of. And look, it's not a secret I'm confused as to why Red has become this walking encyclopedia. Well, not plot-wise, I know Aerith gave him memories of the future, but like, I mean why they chose to do this to Red's character. The best part about his character was that despite his age, he was just a clueless and naive kid. His arc in Cosmo Canyon is so moving and raw and real. He can't really have that arc work now, given his entire character in Remake as being an all-knowing Gandalf character, just like Aerith is now too. It doesn't matter how much you make him do goofy smiles and tail whips, I just don't think you can really have your cake and eat it too with this one. The info about Fort Condor is very interesting though. It's now an island, which is not reachable by regular means. Perhaps later though? With a certain airship, perhaps? An airship you can actually see here on the edge of Junon, which is pretty cool. I'm pretty sure this was also spotted in an earlier trailer, but here's like a better view, which, I don't know, this is pretty cool, man. I love the high wind. The visuals here are also really, really nice. I mean, look at this scenery. This game just looks gorgeous, dude. I can only imagine how some of the other areas in the world will look. Forgotten Capital is going to make me rock solid, I can just tell. While prowling this open space, which we'll discuss properly a little bit down the line, I was searching for little secrets, and one of the ones that I noticed that I thought was worth touching upon was this poster of Stamp, the Shinra mascot. For those in the know, Stamp has been used as an indicator for timelines or universes or whatever you want to call them. Cloud and crew in Remake are in a world which features Beagle Stamp. Then at the end, during Zack's victory, we see a Terrier stamp, indicating that it's some sort of alternate reality or timeline or something. A lot of people speculated that the end of Remake had our party join the Terrier reality, but that's not what's happening. They are still very clearly in the Beagle reality, so who knows what's really going on here, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Moving into Junon itself, we get a nice look at the underside of Junon's fortress and get a greater sense of the disparity between upper and lower Junon, and also a clear mirroring to Midgar. Junon was always this in the original game, but here it emphasizes that a lot more heavily, and it's very much another Midgar situation. Wherever Shinra goes, they step on people. I like this a lot, it's very well executed. We meet a character here called Rhonda. She's the head of things by the look of it, and also has bounties for Avalanche and for Aerith, which I think adds an element of urgency to the party's journey. It's no longer a casual stroll, not that it ever really was that, but now they know Shinra is stopping at nothing to bring them in. They need to win people's trust more than ever. Rhonda, however, lets it slide. She knows Avalanche is fighting for the people, and so lets them head into town, providing them shelter at the inn. Before the gang reach the inn, however, they're called over. Someone is in need of help. Priscilla, who's been aged up. She used to be a literal child in the original game, but now she's more of a like young to mid-teen here, likely because they intend to keep the crush she has on Cloud, but without it being a little bit too weird. Heading down to see what she needs help with, we meet up with a pretty familiar face. It's very interesting they chose to move Yuffie's meeting to here. Whilst I do admire their want to make Yuffie into a major character that's no longer optional and is met through a major story beat, part of me feels that this takes away from essential aspect of her character. And while, sure, the game is making changes, Yuffie and her intermission story followed by this change implies to me that she won't be having the same arc or following the same beats in this game as she did in the original. Her and Priscilla seem to be acquainted, and so clearly Yuffie has been helping out in this town, the opposite of what she would have been doing in the original at this point in her arc. I can't imagine this version of Yuffie stealing our materia twice. It just doesn't seem like the sort of thing that she would do in Remake or Rebirth. And hey look, maybe I'll come to like what they do with her here, but I couldn't just leave it unsaid. Yuffie, though, is helped ashore by none other than Mr. Dolphin, one of my favourite supporting characters from the original game, making a comeback here. A character that Cloud uses as a referential springboard to defeat the sea serpent Bottomswell. In this game, renamed to be Terror of the Deep, which I guess is a bit more menacing than Bottomswell. This is where the demo ends, though, concluding our time with the story for this one as well. I will say, the only other thing I noticed, and I'm not really sure exactly what it means, is the pause menu and inventory screen for both demos had this mysterious backdrop. You've maybe seen it in clips I've used throughout the video so far. If I've used clips of it so far, I don't know. It looks somewhat like it could be the Temple of Ancients, but if it is, what is the significance of it being the backdrop of the inventory menu for the entire game? What draws my attention, though, are these concentric circles on the black, opaque-looking portion of the wall. They're also used on the main menu when selecting the demo we wanted to play, and it does remind me somewhat of Bugenhagen's light show displaying the planets in the system Gaia is a part of, although they do like their concentric circles with smaller circles dotted around in this UI, clearly, as you can see they use it a lot. Is it just a cool design, or is it intentional foreshadowing, mirroring, or reinforcement of thematic importance? I honestly have no idea, but it sure is interesting to look at. Maybe people smarter than me can work it out and come up with a conclusion as to what specifically it might mean, because I've tried to think it out and I really don't know, other than it being a reference to a major moment in Cosmo Canyon, but that seems kind of random unless they've totally altered what happens there and how important space and the solar system truly is for the entire story of the game. I wanted to just take a second to just throw in some additional little details that we got from the short presentation, as there are a few things to glean from it. Things that have all pretty much been talked about in interviews since the most recent trailer dropped, but that's fine, that just makes my job easier here. First thing is that Hamaguchi mentioned the game will feature chocobos plus vehicles, which implies the existence of more than just simply the buggy. I'd be shocked if we don't also see the tiny Bronco in this game, meaning we'll probably meet up with Sid closer to the end of the game, just before the Forgotten Capital, lining up with the idea that some party members will not be playable in this entry, like Red was in Remake. That said, I don't know for sure. The other major thing was that Katase noted the Remake project and emphasized this is 3 games all following the events of the original Final Fantasy VII, which have been expanded to cover these events in greater detail. This is interesting, especially given the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Defeating the Harbinger of Fate, to me, signified a pretty hard shift in the events that would follow. But given this statement, it seems that actually this game will be following the original quite closely, as well as Part 3. I personally find this hard to believe after Remake, and I feel that despite it being what I want, it would be an odd choice after what Remake set up. For this game to deliver on the promises of Remake, it has to stray from the OG, otherwise what was the point? Unless of course they're planning sequels after Part 3, which I wouldn't put it past them. That said, from what we've seen of Zack, it seems pretty clear that this game is not going to be a simple retread of the original game. So I don't really know about that one, Katase. And finally, we also got a few messages from a few of the voice actors that are working on the game. And one specific comment from Brianna White, the voice of Aerith, noted that Aerith was incredibly important to the story of Rebirth. And while Aerith is of course one of the most important characters in Final Fantasy VII, it did feel like a peculiar thing to highlight, because does this imply that she's even more important than she already was? With this game ending at the Forgotten Capital, what could this mean specifically? Only time can tell, but it has got my brain racing. I'm such a Final Fantasy VII bitch, man. One innocuous line from a voice actor and I'm just sitting here fucking overthinking it. Dude, what's wrong with me? That's all I can glean in total though when it comes to the story. Let's move on to the mechanical aspects of it all. The combat itself doesn't reinvent the wheel, but I would say that's a good thing. It shouldn't. Remake had one of the best combat systems, personally, that I've ever played, and it was the perfect evolution of the ATB system if you're going to take it into a real-time context. Because it retains all of the elements that make Final Fantasy VII so good. You can just run around now and be a bit more free and natural with what you do and when you do it. But the fundamental strategy remains unchanged from the original and keeps the core experience faithful. Rebirth itself generally feels the same, although I'd say there's slightly more fluidity to it. Something I said about Remake is that at times it can feel sticky, but in Rebirth it flows a lot better, and the same goes for outside of combat too, but we'll get onto that. On top of the Remake basics and fundamentals, we have a whole slew of new additions to alter the way you interact with the combat itself, from smaller things like Cloud's new dodge move, to larger ones like the ability to perfectly time your blocks. This was something that was semi-introduced in Intermission, but now acts as a full-on feature. If you time your blocks just before an incoming attack, you'll be granted immunity, meaning there seems to be a greater emphasis on things you can do in real-time combat than there was in Remake, where you'd simply be forced to tank hits a lot, similar to the original game. I think if you're going for real-time, it's nice to have this, plus it fills your limit and your ATB gauge, allowing you to retaliate with more command-based attacks. Entering combat has also become more clear. As you move close to a group of enemies, a red ring appears around them. When it's full, they will detect you and activate combat mode. If you make sure the ring doesn't fill, you can actually maneuver around them to grab items or avoid fights in more open spaces, which I think is quite nice. It means you can avoid fights or simply have more control over when you enter them, which is a really great new feature for player agency, especially when dealing with large open spaces with tons of different enemies. It does remove the mimicking of random encounters being forced on you, but I think the balancing and structure of Remake can allow for the player to avoid fights if they so choose. Some people also just don't have the sheer mental fortitude it takes to play a game with random encounters. Okay, let's talk about our party and their new utilization, starting with Sephiroth. During the first demo, the only party member I had alongside Cloud was Sephiroth. This has been revealed by the team and was also shown in the first ever trailer, plus the most recent one, so it's not really a spoiler for those who have played only Remake. Trust me, it's really not. Sephiroth, like I mentioned in the story chapter, doesn't feel tangibly more powerful than Cloud, which is a strange design choice, neglecting to convey the power disparity between the two that's found in the original game. On a mechanical level though, Sephiroth is a very fun character to play as. Wielding Masamune is obviously a goddamn power trip, but in his moveset he's sharp, quick, and lands powerful blows. You press square to slash with Masamune, or you can hold it to unleash a ranged attack with your sword. Landing a certain number of your basic attacks will allow you to perform branching finishes using the triangle button like Pierce or Sword Dance, which fills your limit gauge. More hits means the higher rewarding triangle move, so it's beneficial to try and get as many regular hits in before using the triangle move. It sort of reminds me somewhat of the command styles in Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. It cycled from Aura Charge to Sword Dance to Telluric Fury to Pierce, and all of them provide different types of attacks with varying damage output. Pressing R1 will enter Retaliation stance, while in this stance pressing square at the right time will parry an incoming attack. It's sort of a melding of counter stance and Punisher mode, but more powerful and easier to execute. Sephiroth has two abilities to use in the demo, Zanshin and Hell's Gate, the latter appearing to be a reference to a move he uses at a poignant moment within the original game. Overall, Sephiroth has a full moveset. He's like a regular party member. It's pretty wild, in-depth, and tons of fun to play around with. Working alongside Cloud, we can tap into synergy skills and abilities, which are separate things. This goes for all party members. Synergy skills don't consume ATB. They're sort of like regular attacks, but with party members, and you can work them into combos for greater effect. You hold R1 to guard, and then press the corresponding face button to team up with a particular party member for a team-based attack. It's mainly a flourish to combat, but it can be utilized in a way to deal a little bit more damage at the end of a combo, or to crowd control where a single character might struggle. I think this element tries to marry what was introduced with Sonon in Intermission without making it totally overpowered, and allow a bit more choice with what you do in the real-time combat of it all, instead of only having your bog standard basic attacks. Synergy abilities are where we get a little bit more crazy though. There are some story-based synergy abilities it seems, as the first one you encounter is with Sephiroth in the cave against the Materia Guardian, called Double Helix. The description is as follows. Sephiroth unleashes an elegant flurry of strikes and Cloud does his best to follow suit. raises Cloud's limit level and grants Sephiroth unlimited MP. These attacks, while fancy and powerful, also contain specific buffs. This one raising Cloud's limit level so he can pull off Ascension, a limit he couldn't pull off before by simply raising his limit gauge to maximum, which adds a level of strategy, not just to when you use these moves, but which ones you choose for the long-term effects that come with them. It's also interesting this game reintroduces limit levels like there are in the OG. However, higher limit levels are sometimes accessible via synergy abilities as they are here with Sephiroth. In the OG, you would slowly raise everyone's limit level to unlock new limits for higher limit level ranges across the game. I wonder if it's the same process in Rebirth or whether it's been entirely changed. Perhaps it's part of the skill tree now? Who knows? Other synergy abilities are gained through what the developers have said are skill trees, which is a new addition to this game that I didn't get to see, but I hope isn't cumbersome as it can be in some games. Some of the ones I got to play around with in Junon were for a range of different combinations that all have different effects. For example, Firework Blade will allow Cloud and Aerith to team up, but afterwards it grants a temporary unlimited MP boost. For Relentless Rush, Cloud and Tifa, it'll increase potency on staggered enemies and increase the stagger duration. There's an incredible wealth of potential to different moves to be used at different times for different effects in different circumstances, and man, I can just imagine how this will feel by the end of the game, because it felt incredible every time I pulled it off here, and having the perfect team setup for you will not only be satisfying to dominate the harder fights, but it really does work to build up a sense of bond between your members. Story and gameplay synergy is one of my biggest turn-ons. The other major new addition is of course Red 13 being playable. I believe the devs discussed this in their blog post about how Red's gameplay functions, but I'll go over it here because I don't think they really talked about it in great detail. Pressing square swipes at enemies with your basic attack. Holding it down unleashes a whirling attack that's similar to Cloud's AoE move when you hold square with him, but Red sort of has a greater range to it, swirling around in circles and moving around a decent bit, which feels really cool, I will say. Successfully guarding against attacks fills Red's Vengeance gauge, which can be consumed with the press of triangle to then enter Vengeance mode. I'll be honest with you, I was under pressure and only had limited time and didn't really get a hang of this properly, so I have no footage of me getting this right, but I might have some B-roll from Square that shows it off, so I'll pop it up on screen if I do. Vengeance mode increases Red's attack power and dodge speed and can be activated at any time, but it will last longer depending on how full the gauge is, obviously. Red has 4 abilities that I could use in this demo as well. Sidewinder, a basic air-to-ground attack. Sentinel Stance, guards against attacks to greatly increase your Vengeance gauge, and you can press square to deliver a counter-strike upon being attacked, similar to Counter Stance, except it's triggered with a button press. Crescent Claw slashes at a foe, but if you deplete the gauge while in Vengeance mode, it increases potency and range. And finally, Stardust Ray, a devastating AoE attack costing 2 ATB. Red did feel great to control. He had a wide range of moves, and that Vengeance system, which I couldn't get to grips with while I was playing but understood better afterwards, will be something that I'm sure will be great fun to use and play with. Red is just a really nice playstyle, which is something I value about VII Remake and again in Rebirth, is that every character has their own strengths and weaknesses, and you really have to use them in conjunction with each other for the best results. And Red is a superb addition to that. I think my biggest issue is he felt at times like he had very little range to his attacks, which makes sense, but I was constantly chasing after enemies and then attacking just short of them and not magnetizing to them, and would just be flailing in the air, which was funny but a little bit annoying. Every other character though that was in Remake plays pretty much the same. There might be some small tweaks here and there, but I didn't have long enough with them to really notice. But they did feel pretty much the same as they do in Remake, which is good. They're just going to be built upon with new moves as we progress through this game, I would feel. In terms of other notable abilities worth talking about, Comet Materia returns from the OG. I had it as Red, but I never used it because I was too focused on taking down the boss efficiently with Thunder instead of experimenting with materia like a dumbass. The description reads, divert the trajectories of small comets so they drop on enemies, dealing non-elemental damage. So that's cool. Morph Materia also returns in Rebirth, which can have a chance to turn an injured enemy into an item, just like in the original game. It feels like Remake was being a lot more conserved with its content, despite also being deep and complex. But now we've left Midgar, the game is just adding all the things from the OG that Remake didn't have, and I think that was a smart move. It leaves the opportunity for new things to be exciting and to greatly alter how you approach the game. All of this comes together in the boss fights though. There were 2 that I played, 1 in each demo. Materia Guardian and Terror of the Deep, being Materia Keeper and Bottom's Well in the OG respectively. Both fights follow the approach that you know from Remake. It's not broken, don't fix it, right? The key is to pressure the enemy using their weaknesses and then use that pressure to stagger them to deal huge amounts of damage and win the fight. If you use Assess, it will actually tell you, at least in the case of Materia Guardian, what will pressure the boss. I can't remember if that was a thing in Remake, but I can't really be bothered to check it. I mean, look, it doesn't really matter, does it? I felt that both fights did more to utilize the placement of your character within the arena more than Remake tended to do. Like I said earlier, Remake often had you simply tank damage a lot of the time. Rebirth does reward you for dodging and well-timed blocks to avoid damage, which seems to be a noticeable shift in how they approach combat design. Materia Guardian was a lot more scripted, needing the double helix move to be a particular moment, as I suppose it's also the first boss in the game, as I'd expect the game opens with the Nibelheim flashback. Terror of the Deep was a bit more tough and freeform, using these classic bubbles like in the OG to trap your party members, although there wasn't quite as much strategy to dispel them, which was slightly disappointing. In the OG, they can only be broken using magic. In Rebirth, you can just sort of smack them about and they'll break. It's a small thing for sure, but still, I liked that element of strategy in the original game. Similarly, the Materia Guardian is now damaged by fire, but in the OG, it would absorb fire spells, but it was susceptible to stop and poison magic, I believe. It's a small change, again, but one that I think opts to remove an element of strategy. Although, with it being the first boss, maybe I can forgive it. I would assume it comes back later on in the game. Maybe then it's evolved to absorb your fire damage and it will actually be the same as the original version, who really knows. Overall though, I do think the Scorpion Sentinel is a much better first boss, teaching the player everything they need to know for the game to come. If you don't understand the game systems after you come out of the Scorpion Sentinel, well, you won't come out of the Scorpion Sentinel. You have to understand how to play the game to beat that fight. I didn't feel the same way with the Materia Guardian, which while that's worse for newcomers, you'd imagine most people playing this won't be newcomers, so it's not that big of a hit. That said though, the bosses are still strategic, balanced, and good fun. I can imagine these on hard mode will be a blast, especially Bottom's Well. Sorry, Terror of the Deep. In terms of general RPG mechanics and party management, I didn't really get to play around with it a whole lot. The party and gear was locked, and so I wasn't able to mess around with different builds or materia slots, mainly for ease of gameplay during the demo, which is understandable. But each character has a set of stats, the same as Remake, raised and lowered by different gear and weapons and levels, which, I mean, is pretty standard. You're probably thinking, why am I telling you there's meaningful stats in a JRPG? Because, well, you know, sometimes they just miss the memo, don't they, on that. There were a couple of new materia that I did snag, though, during these demos, those being Spare Change, Lightning and Wind as one joint spell, Level Boost, and Autocast. Spare Change is often known as Guild Toss, which is something that was featured in Crisis Core Reunion, I'm pretty sure, but it wasn't in Remake, allowing players to throw their money at enemies for more damage the more money you have. It's basically pay to win, but not the other kind of pay to win. It was in the OG as well, but only after leveling up the throw materia. It seems they've disconnected those mechanics here, or simply erased throw entirely. Level boost is pretty obvious. It's either a renaming of AP up, or it's the equivalent but for your character level, as well as auto cast. I assume it's like auto cure, but for offensive spells. But the interesting one is the combined lightning and wind spell. I wasn't actually able to equip it as I couldn't edit my build, but the obvious assumption is you can combine spells in this game, which will likely lower their individual power output, but will allow for both elemental effects to attack an enemy, which is interesting. I could have gone into the inventory to check all of these exact descriptions, but like I said, look, I was under pressure and I didn't think to do that until after I played and was watching my footage back at home. You win some, you lose some. Talking about materia combinations though, there is a new transmutation feature which allows for you to use resources that you find scattered around the world to craft items and gear, which is... yeah, I don't know how to feel about this, because on the one hand, it's cool, it allows scouring the world to have meaning. On the other hand, every game has a crafting system, and it makes me sometimes want to shoot myself in the skull. It really depends how this works in practice and context of the wider world. It's really tough for me to say, based on so little time with it. Mist potions are also interesting, healing the entire party. I hope having 2 ways to heal everyone through this and your Magnify Cure isn't so much of a big crutch that it destroys the balancing. we'll see. The coolest thing I found from the whole RPG party system is that you can, in the full game, not in the demo, set up preset parties from your list of party members that you can then switch out during gameplay outside of combat. In the demo, I had the options of 3 different default parties, being Cloud, Aerith, and Tifa, Cloud, Barret, and Red, and then Cloud, Aerith, and Red, meaning I could test out several different combinations and swap them on the fly in the world without having to go into the pause menu. And I thought that was really cool. I really love this idea. Another really great part of this is that your whole party will always be with you. Your main team will be the ones that you're playing with and fighting as, but your other guys will be with you at all times while you're exploring, and during fights will stand off to the side casting spells and just generally supporting you. It's really nice. I love that idea. I think it's just brilliant. Navigation has been altered in this game. I was so worried that the game would become open and sprawling, but you'd have the same sticky movement system that was in Remake. And while they haven't changed it entirely, it feels so much better to move around. The general speed and fluidity of animations feels a lot nicer, but also your range of movement feels better. In Remake, to climb anything, you have to walk towards a little blue arrow and do a long animation. In Rebirth, you have terrain actions, which are activated by just running up to something, and you will hop over it if it's a small obstacle, or climb onto a cliff or a box or a railing. It's almost parkour, honestly. Sometimes you will find it a bit silly. You're sort of just parkouring on anything and everything you run at, usually for no reason. I climbed this whole tower thing in the middle of the Junon map to find some boxes that had just a potion in it, and then I slid back down. Or there's this farmhouse that I climbed it, but there was, for no reason, there's nothing there. It just let me climb on it. It just looks really silly sometimes. But I think overall the benefits outweigh the jank, because it means levels can be designed as more than just flat floors that you run around in, with preset animations to get you up and down levels. You can very organically jump up a cliff and dive down it anywhere. It makes it a lot more fluid to get around. And the way that materia and chests are now placed feels like they're actually off the beaten track. You really feel like you're able to explore and wander, and I think that's a huge improvement, even inside of linear levels, especially in a game that goes for much larger spaces to explore as well. There's also a climbing mechanic akin to something like Horizon Zero Dawn with these yellow ledges. I can't lie, it is very linear, it's no Uncharted, it is janky to look at times too, but I will say, it's better than Remake. It's not incredible, and it's still a symptom of the on-rails nature of what began with Remake, but it's an attempt to break those shackles by giving some diversity to how you navigate with player inputs, as you have to press X to climb up, but it's still very automated, and it does look a little bit rough. That said, this is an early build, so I can't really be too harsh on the presentation front of it all. Another thing I did notice, and it didn't happen too much, but there is this long-ass shimmy sequence that I can only assume is loading the next area. This sort of stuff doesn't hugely bother me, but I know it could bother some people. Just know this was the only time I experienced this in both demos, so it seems to be a lot less intrusive than it was in Remake, with all the gaps and forced walking and stuff you had to do in that game while the rick of the old PS4 loaded the next area. One of the cooler things that I'm really interested to see developed on later on in the game is this little mini puzzle where you use this big box vacuum thing to suck up a Mako flood that's disabled the power to the elevator. This wasn't very deep, but it speaks to the idea that they're potentially working to incorporate more environmental puzzle solving into gameplay, perhaps more elements to overcome in dungeons other than basic combat and walking to interactable things for an animation to play out. Instead, it seems they're allowing you to directly interact with an area to solve a puzzle. This was likely the tutorial one for the purposes of the demo, but I do hope we see some harder and more advanced uses of this sort of design philosophy in other areas of the game. Do we have any more notes? Oh yeah, the mini map's better in this. Like it's actually helpful now. So good on you, Square. Well done. The final major topic I want to talk about, right, is the open world. Hold your horses, okay? Look, it's not an open world. It's more like open zones that are all connected to each other through what appear to be choke points. I talked a little bit about this on my stream where I broke down the most recent trailer, but because I wasn't allowed to talk about the fact that I played the game, I couldn't really give any actual examples or first-hand experience, so I'll do that here. I've not seen enough to know concretely, but how it seems to be is that this is not a Final Fantasy 16 situation where there are like 10 disconnected zones that are linked together by just a world map that you then fast travel to, but tons of zones that are literally linked and traversable by the player at will, not fast travels and load times in place of actual traversable space. The world is seamless, yet also your progression through it is linear. That's my hypothesis. For example, in my demo, we exit the Mithril Mines and are in a large open space outside of Junon. It was smaller for the demo. In the full game, it'll be larger, including this area with the shipwreck. From here, we can explore, do side activities, and we'll talk about all that later on. Then, when we're ready to progress, you enter this town seamlessly and are in Under Junon for the next part of your quest. I'd assume from there, you navigate to Upper Junon through a story mission, across the sea to Costa del Sol, then from there to another open space before progressing into Corel. The best thing I have in my head right now to liken it to is like Dark Souls. If it had like small open worlds between every major dungeon or landmark, but not like Elden Ring, a bit more enclosed than that. So it's like one interconnected world that is progressed through in a linear fashion, yet allows for you to return to previous areas at will, either by fast traveling to unlock fast travel points, or just by walking all the way back there, which is pretty similar to the OG, honestly, but isn't one huge open world like The Witcher or Assassin's Creed, where you can just run from one side to the other just in a straight line. You have to go through a specific funneled route. And what this means is that you'll be probably encouraged to return to earlier areas after acquiring new things, such as chocobos that can climb rocks or glide, so you're able to find new things in these older areas of the map, Metroidvania style. It seems to me that this game follows the world exploration of the original game to an extent, allowing you to get from start to finish through a linear series of events, and then likely in part 3 you'll gain access to the airship, allowing you to navigate wherever you so choose and to areas you couldn't even reach before. I've said it before, and I will always prefer the overworld system. I just think it's a better way to convey the scale of your world without getting too bogged down by the semantics of it all and the specifics and the minutiae of tiny little details. But if you're gonna do it this way with the presentation of Remake, this is probably the best structure that you can go with. If my hypothesis is correct, this sounds like the ideal way of handling the world space. The small area I had to explore though didn't have a whole lot going for it, and that's partly due to the fact that it was only a small slice of gameplay for the means of a short demo, so I can't truly judge the quality or quantity of content. You navigate to points of interest using the world map, which is a lot more helpful than Remake, so that's a plus. You can tag points if you want to visit them and then hop on over. The only real thing I had to try out were these fiend sightings, which had you fight these legendary sort of enemies for rewards with optional objectives to complete, which gain you more regional research points or something, although I'm not really sure what it actually does. You're also probably wondering what this thing is, MAI, and the answer is, I have no clue what that is. It's like a virtual AI that just like spouts information about enemies and the region, and it's actually really fucking annoying. Hopefully there's an option to turn that off in the full game, because it's beyond irritating, and if I want to know more about the enemies I'm fighting, I'll just assess them. The rewards for beating these fiends though feel a bit lacking in terms of what you're getting and the context from them. They're just sort of random fights that I'm sure after the first 5 to 10, I'm just going to find boring. You don't just navigate these areas on foot though. You of course have chocobos, which are a staple of Final Fantasy, and Red riding one of these guys is never not hilarious. They have the ability to walk and sprint, as well as do this cool boost thing, which is pretty sweet, and they'll manually jump over obstacles to navigate with efficiency. They're smooth and they feel good. It's great stuff. Only thing I love is a dedicated jump button like in Final Fantasy 16, because as far as I could tell, there wasn't one. One of the cooler things though is that when I went over to this little farmhouse place where I could buy some goods and things, I was also able to customize my chocobo, which, hey, look, that's nice, eh? I hope this game still has chocobo breeding, but I can't really be 100% sure at this point. Hey, fingers crossed I get to grind for that golden chocobo. The chocobos are also able to pick up scents of special items. When the question mark appears above their head, if you hit the scent button, it'll start sniffing, and upon finding it, you can scour and dig up the goods. Like, this is like a decently good feature. I just couldn't for the life of me figure out how to get it to work. Granted, this might be my stark incompetence, but I just couldn't work out how to do it. It might have been bugged, genuinely confusing, or I was being stupid under pressure, but it's worth noting that happened nonetheless. The final thing with chocobos is how they integrate fast travel. You'll spot this little baby chocobo hanging around. By following it, you'll eventually reach this torn down signpost. After picking it up, you'll unlock fast travel to that specific location, and you can pat the little chocobo on his head. I'm aware them doing this is a cheap bit of marketing by getting their game posted on Can You Pet the Dog, and I hate that I'm aware of that. All game developers do that these days, but still. I mean, it's cute. Fast travel points also have benches, which, when in an open world, you can use a cushion to fully restore your HP and MP. I quite like them limiting the amount you can restore your HP and MP by tying it to an item, very much like the sort of equivalent of a tent or sleeping bag. It's really cool. I like that. I think overall with gameplay, it feels they've improved on Remake in every capacity, playing into the strengths of Final Fantasy wherever possible and fine-tuning their structuring, pacing, and general feel from combat to the movement system. The biggest issue I have so far is how boring I found the open worlds to be. Yet, of course, it was a trimmed down and toned down version for the demo. Less things to find and less things to do, less of a space to explore, and that's something to keep in mind. But what I did experience, I found lacking, and often quite boring, despite the base gameplay itself being pretty fantastic. I think though the open zones seem to serve as a way to keep the experience feeling longer without padding out the main story, as they sometimes did in Remake, which means they possibly have found a balance that makes the core of the game far more fun, to the point, and authentic to Final Fantasy VII in spirit and feel, even if not always in plot. And I think that's everything I had to say. I hope this didn't drag on, and I hope you learned things, because I tried my best to squeeze as much as possible, both story and gameplay, out of the time that I had with Rebirth. I think for me, despite being very wary of where this remake project is going and how it feels untrue to the core themes of the original that attached me to it in the first place, what I can say is that the game itself feels fun and improves on Remake in all the areas that it needed to. Obviously, I've only played just over an hour. It's not nearly enough to be certain of the total quality of the game, so don't take my word as gospel. Go listen to some other people, wait for more footage if you're uncertain. But if you liked Remake, odds are you're gonna like Rebirth. That's what I'm feeling. And if you didn't like Remake for structural or pacing reasons, you might find more to love this time. However, if you were at odds with the direction of the story, if you felt the unification of the compilation was trite, if you weren't impressed by them altering major story points, then I can't say this game will be for you either. That said, I'm still looking forward to hopping in. I'm looking forward to streaming my first time playthrough and turning that into a video, and I had a lot of fun putting this video together. So thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to Square for inviting me. I hope I wasn't too harsh on the game, and don't forget to drop a like and subscribe for more. Thank you everybody, and I will see you all very soon. Bye-bye.